We're very happy today to have Professor Peter Nash, formerly Dean of the School of Environmental Studies at the University of Waterloo, a geographer with a very varied career. Today I'm going to ask him about his background and the influences on his own career experience. Peter, begin. I was born.
That I was actually not too far from here where we are sitting, not in Switzerland, but in Germany, in the city of Frankfurt, where I spent the early years of my life, where I had my elementary education. Mm-hmm. And then my parents moved to France, where I spent a couple of years. Then I was shipped off to England to a public school, and from there my parents moved to the United States. I spent high school in England, in California, in Los Angeles. Junior high was in England, high school in California. I went to the university in California, then the Army, then back to California, Wisconsin, but I think you want probably a few more details.
Oh, each of those places must have left an impression.
It was not something that I decided on very early in my life, being a geographer, yes. But it's something that developed rather gradually. Mm-hmm. I must say that revisiting the place of one's birth, which I did just a few days ago before coming to Geneva, the city of Frankfurt, gives you somewhat of a clue as to what really went on in my own mind and what might have planted the seed and developed some of this geographic thirst, yes, that we are interested in. Yes. And I know this is one of the things you are particularly yes. concerned with. I was walking along the River Main with my wife and showed her the house where I was born, on the Untermain-Kai, where I lived the first 4 years of my life, the house in which I was born. And I remember sitting on the balcony of that house, overlooking the Main River and seeing the boats coming down the Main and also going up the Main, of course, and thinking to myself, where are these boats going? And people were rather imprecise about their answers. Oh, they're going to the ocean, they said. But I answered, well, how far away is the ocean? Can we go there? And they said, oh no, the ocean is very far away. So I think even at that age, I was probably about 4 years old, I asked my father to show me a map. And I remember he had a huge globe in his study too, and he showed me that not far down the river, the Main flows into the Rhine at Mainz. And then later on some of our bicycle tours, we went down the Rhine Graben, so to speak. And then I found out it still had to go through Holland. Mm-hmm. And then as my Heimat, as we used to call it, and some people still call it that, expanded, and I was able to walk around more by myself before the area turned, and it was no longer so safe to walk around in. I used to walk to the Hauptbahnhof, the main station of Frankfurt. I wasn't supposed to go there, but I did. Uh-huh. And there were these 24 platforms, and there were big signs where all these trains were going. And so this sparkled my imagination, and I made mental travels as to, I said to myself, what train will I take today? Uh-huh. And I'd go to platform 8 to take a train to Zurich or to Paris or to Milan or wherever. And I walked to the Hauptbahnhof this time with my wife, and and all these thoughts came back to me.
What years are we talking about now?
We are talking now about 1925, 1926.
Okay.
And then another thought occurred to me. We were staying at the Frankfurt Canadian Pacific Plaza Hotel, which is a very high hotel, high-rise hotel near the Festhalle. Looking down on the neighborhood whereto my parents moved after we moved away from the Untermainkai address to the West End, which really was my home for 3 or 4 more years. And there I recognized all kinds of important foci in the city, and I realized that in that period my interest in cities began. Mm-hmm. And I identified these focal points, whether it was the Festhalle or the Hauptwache mm-hmm. or the Bockenheimer Landstraße mm-hmm. or the Zeil, a major shopping street, and I could go on naming these. But what intrigued me is that even though the city has changed enormously, mm-hmm. these important foci are still there. Mm-hmm. All the important points, the reference points, and they're still very much important to the citizens who live there. They're still important reference points. And to some extent the Hauptwache, which is the perhaps the major focus of the city, mm-hmm. is still the major focus now, because all the tramway lines, all the streetcar lines, all the subway lines sort of focus on that. Just like Paris is a focus for France, the Hauptwache is the focus for Frankfurt. But all the streetcar lines are still there and still have the same numbers. And all the numbers came back to me because I used to sit in the streetcar lines and just travel from one end of the city to the other.
I see.
And investigate all the suburbs, whether it was Schwanheim or Offenbach or Oberursel and so on. And so I think from a very early age, I became interested in the city, the site of Frankfurt, mm-hmm. as well as the situation because of the river and the railroad. Not because I traveled anywhere, but because I saw all these choo-choo trains coming and going. And so all these thoughts came back to me just a few days ago when I visited Frankfurt again and showed the city of my birth to my wife.
That's marvelous.
Not that I thought about geography at that time.
No.
In fact, if I remember correctly, I only had about 2 years of Erdkunde in the gymnasium, mm-hmm. and I don't think I did too well, except for map drawing.
You liked maps?
I liked maps, I always did, but I wasn't so good in memorization, uh-huh. and that's something we'll touch on later on, because when geography became a subject where I had to memorize at one university later on, I was turned off, you see. Mm-hmm. So I think geography should always be a subject that kindles your imagination, but it really shouldn't be something where you have to memorize.
Yes.
And in the minds of the public, too often it's a subject where you sort of are supposed to be a walking atlas, and somebody says, how high is this mountain, or how many people live in that city, you're supposed to know automatically. Yeah. And if you don't know, they say, well, I thought you were a geographer, right?
Yes.
I'm sure it's happened to you hundreds of times.
Oh, yes, yes. So you did gymnasium in Germany, in France?
Not all of it.
Not all of it.
I then lived in France for a year and a half outside of Paris. Then my parents sent me to England. They felt I should go to a public school in England. My brother was sent to Switzerland, not far from here, to Lausanne. I finished high school in England at Lindhe College in Essex. Mm-hmm. And then in 1937, my parents sent me a telegram to meet me on aboard the SS Washington in Southampton Harbor on their trip to the United States. And I lived in New York for about a month. And then we went on through the Panama Canal to Los Angeles. And there I went to Los Angeles City College for 2 years, UCLA for 2 years, and then I entered the Army, the U.S. Army.
What a saga. You didn't say what your father's occupation was.
My father was a judge in Germany, and then because part of my family was Jewish, he was asked to resign from the bench. A couple of years after Hitler came to power, then he went into the business of his father-in-law, my grandfather, and he thought the whole thing sort of would finish after 2 or 3 years, but it didn't. And then, with very good advice from some of my relatives, he decided to move to the United States. I still have some relatives in the Frankfurt area. Some of them stayed because some of them are Protestants and some of them are Catholics, and we're very good friends, and we had get-togethers. Some of them I remembered me from as a little boy, and some of them I had actually never seen, but we had some good family reunions just a few days ago. But it was a good thing for that my family moved, because on the other side of the family, some of them ended up in concentration camps, and that wasn't so good.
Oh, dear me.
But
now we're in Los Angeles.
Now we're in Los Angeles. All of a sudden, I had to decide, when I entered Los Angeles City College, my father had to leave most of his property behind, so we were not wealthy, not destitute either, but I had to go to a college that was free. I think the total cost for a year's tuition was $10, which is very surprising in this day and age. Yeah. But one of the first questions I was asked was, what are you going to major in? And I was given a list of subjects. Well, I had not given too much thought about it. I knew I didn't want to go into business,
yes,
because financial independence really didn't mean that much to me. And I saw the word geography. I had a very good geography teacher in England, by the way, who let me draw lots of maps, and who was a very stimulating lecturer. Yeah. His name was Joseph Ecott. He had just graduated from Cambridge University, and we became good friends. He was also my football and tennis coach, and I was much interested in sports at that time. And so I think I decided I had to decide between geology and geography, but because I was also very much interested in rocks. And but then I saw that you had to take all kinds of chemistry and physics. And I thought, well, I didn't want to start in with chemistry right away, and there were all kinds of interesting courses listed with geography. So I said, okay, I'll major in geography, which I did. And I did rather well. So in my junior year, I went on to UCLA. And I had some very good teachers.
Who was there?
And one of the teachers that took me under her wing right away, and I know you know whose name I'm going to mention, was Ruth Ball, B-A-U-G-H, yes, who was the disciple, I think, of Ellen Churchill Semple.
Oh, yes.
Of course, at that time, the name Semple didn't mean anything to me, right? And but she was a lovely lady, and she had a great deal of concern for me as an individual human being. And we talked a lot about Europe and about geography. And one of the first things she did was to give me Simple's book on the geography of the Mediterranean.
Oh, that was one of my first books in geography.
Was it?
Oh, I really like that one.
And that
Good.
book really overwhelmed me because it is so beautifully written,
Yes.
and it's also a very scholarly book.
Yes.
And I thought, gee, what a wonderful book. All these footnotes with Latin and Greek and Arabic sources, not to speak of French and German and Italian and so on. And her book on the pastures of the Mediterraneans and the irrigation lands of the Mediterraneans, and all the world is heir to the Mediterranean, all the world is her debtor. And her descriptions of the Mediterranean pleasure gardens and so on. So I took her course on the geography of the Mediterranean. So she became my mentor to some extent. I also had courses from Robert Glendinning, who was much more rigid, much more Apollonian in his thinking. I had courses from Joseph Spencer, who was a disciple of Carl Sauer. There was Clifford Zierer, who taught a course on the geography of resources. There was Henry Bruman, also a product of the Berkeley School, on the geography of Latin America. But I really liked regional geography. And it's not until much later that I got into the systematic aspects. I graduated in 1942, and at that time I was ready to go into the army, but I still had not gotten my US citizenship, and I was told I had to wait. And I remember shortly after graduation, Robert Glendinning came to me and said, "Would you like to teach a course, the introductory course in geography, starting next week?" And I said, "Mom!" I had never even thought about something like that. I was ready to go into the army. It was the summer session. And I said, "Well, I don't know whether I can do it or not." And he said, "Well, I think you can, but if you have any questions, I'll be in my office and you can ask me." So a week later, I had 120 people sitting in my class on introductory geography, and and I wasn't even 21 yet.
Oh my!
You see,
what a
so
challenge.
I was pushed into teaching geography, but I very soon found out that I liked it.
Yes.
And I did this for all that summer, and that fall I taught both the first and second semester of the first year of introductory geography, and then I entered the army. And because I could read maps, they put me into the Corps of Engineers, and I trained in Alabama and Missouri, and was sent overseas. And when they found out I was also fluent in a number of languages, they put me into the intelligence. I was asked, in fact, it was the OSS. They were going to put me into very sensitive intelligence work, but I flunked one test.
Deliberately?
No, not deliberately, much to my chagrin. It was the involuntary reaction test. It's a test where they see how you react to certain things. And I found out that I blush very easily. And if you blush very easily, even if you're not guilty about anything that's embarrassing or so on, you cannot be used in that particular type of activity. So because I blush easily, I was put into the prisoner interrogation section. But I was also used first to link up with the Free French, and I was dropped with a parachute in France before D-Day, and we made some of the connection with the Free French, and I was with the combat engineers for the first part of the war. I was wounded during the Battle of the Bulge, sent back to Paris. Then I was attached to the Mobile Field Intelligence Unit, number 4, under Omar Bradley. And then we interviewed prisoners of war both in Luxembourg and then in Wiesbaden. And we had some high-ranking generals, including von Rundstedt. I even had Julius Streicher in prison in Wiesbaden. And I was alone with him for a little while, and but I restrained myself.
What an experience.
I had another interesting experience. I'm just telling you about the experiences that have some geographical interests. I was asked by my commanding officer to interview Karl Haushofer. And so I spent about 10 days with him and his wife in, I think it was a name like Hochschimmelhof or something like that, in Bavaria, and wrote up a complete account on my findings, including that there was really no Institute für Geopolitik. It was a top secret document which was later taken by Father Walsh and published mostly published under his name in Life magazine, but I couldn't do anything about that. But that will always be something that I will remember very much.
That must have been a dramatic experience.
But I learned a lot about Haushofer, and even today in my classes on the history of geographic thought, when I speak about Ratzel, I always tell them about what Karl told what's Ratzel's first name?
Friedrich.
What Friedrich told Karl, and then what Karl told Rudolf, and then Rudolf told Adolf, and how these thoughts then influenced to some extent how some thoughts of a geographer really influenced the history of the world.
Yes.
It's not to be taken lightly, but
be sure.
It makes a nice little story how the concepts of a geographer, how Ratzel's thoughts sort of flowed. It's part of the history of geographic thought into the minds of, let's say, a major policymaker, right? Yes. From his cellmate, and perhaps for those who will see this tape, I should say that I was speaking of Hess, right? Yes. Rudolf Hess then told Adolf Hitler, and that these thoughts then went into Mein Kampf and became party policy. So another aspect, perhaps, that I should mention that went into my later thinking was that I saw so many cities destroyed.
That must have been traumatic.
Right? And when you see all these cities destroyed and even help to destroy them, if you're a feeling human being, you must really think about too later on what will be built up in their place, right? And those were the seeds of my interest in city planning.
I can see it. Yes. That's a really clear connection.
So it's Frankfurt and the outskirts of Munich and the World War II. And this was the basis. Am I speaking in too much detail?
No, that was a perfectly good thing. Because then after the war, when you came over, were there any other wartime experiences that were quite as dramatic as that?
Yes. Well, particularly the post-war experiences. I could mention a few more, but they would be along the same line. But there was a major immediate post-war experience.
Yes.
It was after VE Day, and we were all waiting to be shipped to Japan. VE Day, again for the listeners, was Victory in Europe Day. I guess that's what the abbreviation is, because later on there was VJ Day, victory in Japan. And we were sort of marching time. I was stationed in Oberursel at a prisoner of war camp where we had to interview prisoners, either strategic discourses or tactical squeezes, whatever was needed. And a memoranda came around about who wanted to go to a university. And everybody wanted to go to the Sorbonne and so on. And I said to myself, no, I'll do something different. I won't have a chance because everybody wants to go to the Sorbonne. I looked over the list and I saw the Université de Grenoble.
Good, tell that one.
And I was always very much interested, as I told you, in rocks and mountains. I love the mountains and loved mountain climbing. I didn't tell you about the vacations we took in Switzerland and so on. So I said, no, I want to go to Grenoble because I want to study mountain geography, right? So mine was one of the first to come through. Nash,
Good.
Grenoble,
What a thrill.
right? So off I went. And there I was, actually I had to teach two courses, one on the geography of the United States in French to the French students that were there, and then one on the geography of France in English to the Americans that were stationed there.
I see.
And I only had to do that on Wednesdays and Thursdays, these lectures. Then I had big weekends.
I see.
And those weekends, I got to know Raoul Blanchard, who became my mentor. And so we took a lot of field trips into the Pre-Alps, particularly. Also into the various massifs and into the interalpine zone. And I also took a couple of trips into Switzerland. I should tell you one short story. I had a girlfriend from my early youth that lived in Geneva. I was just reminiscing about that yesterday. And I thought I'd make contact with her, and I called her, but I didn't have much money. So I asked Raoul Blanchard how I could finance that, and he had an excellent idea, and I learned one of my first lessons in international economic geography. He said, Nash, allez à Lyon et achetez un saxophone. Buy a saxophone, he said, because the Swiss need musical instruments. And then, when you get there, buy something that the French need. So I took the train to Lyon and bought a saxophone. When I came to Geneva, I sold my saxophone. I had quite a bit of money to spend, and I met her again and her parents. We had a lovely weekend. Then on Monday morning, I bought a nice little Hermes typewriter. These were these little typewriters.
Yes.
I put it in my briefcase and took it back in Lyon. I got enough money for it just to buy another saxophone. And so I financed my occasional weekend in Switzerland. But
Blanchard advised you to do that.
Blanchard advised me to do that.
Fine.
And but I was so impressed with Blanchard because it was really microgeography at its very best. He knew everyone. And I should tell you right now, so I don't forget later, that I did a great deal of field work with him in the Vercors, in the Massif du Vercors, one of the pre-alpine massifs right outside of Grenoble. And I gathered so much material there that I carried it back with me and analyzed it and drew the maps that I sketched, and that became my master's thesis in geography at UCLA. Right?
That was the
which
Vercors.
I did with Ruth Ball. And I also published my very first article in 1945 in the Revue de Géographie Alpine about the destructions in the Vercors by the German army, because the Vercors is it's a mountain bastion like this, Argonian limestone. It's a syncline, very flat top, and the Maquis, the Free French, hid out there, but they were inaccessible. But one night, the Germans landed there with gliders, about 200 strong, and they killed almost everybody in the area, all the livestock, and the whole area was destitute. And so Blanchard and I went around and made a survey of all the things that happened, and that also became one of the chapters in my thesis. But he and I became very good friends, and I'll just tell you one more thing. It's one August day, we were high in the Alps, we stopped at the farmhouse, and we had lunch out on the lawn, and as usual we had a few drinks, not cheese, because he didn't like cheese.
No.
Very interesting for a Frenchman not to like cheese.
It's extraordinary.
Je ne veux pas de fromage, you know, say. But then we heard somebody talk about la bombe atomique. And I asked him, qu'est-ce que c'est la bombe atomique? And he said, je sais pas. Well, we went off somewhere else. In the evening, we went to another alpine hut where they had a little bar. And again, people were talking about la bombe atomique. And I asked him again. And so he said, okay, I'll find out. So he went over and talked to these people. Then he came back to me and he said, Nash, la guerre est finie! La guerre est finie! The war is over!
Fantastic moment.
And then we got drunk. And I knew I wouldn't have to go to Japan.
Fantastic.
I'll always remember that.
That must have been a most
And that was, and the war was over 3 days before, and I didn't even know about it because we were up in the mountains.
Up in the mountains. That must be.
So from there, I also worked a little bit with Paul Véret, who was a young assistant at that time, and I look forward to meeting him in Annecy in a couple of weeks, who helped me with my French and with that article to be published. And then after all that, I went back, did my master's. Then I decided, where will I go? Well, Hartshorne had just come out with his Nature of Geography. I decided, all right, there were other universities where I wanted to go. I had a chat with Carl Sauer. He didn't seem to be too interested in giving any assistantships. He said, after you've been here for a year or two, maybe we'll give you one. That wasn't too encouraging, even though I knew Jan Bruck quite well. I had an offer from Ohio State, a couple of other universities, but Hartshorne, okay. I went there and he was very friendly, and I picked him as my advisor, but then I couldn't because Trewartha was chairman of the department. But Trewartha made me take all kinds of courses, like climatology, and he made me take his China seminar and so on. And I was told exactly what to teach and how to teach it from the famous Bible at that time, Finch and Trewartha, Elements of Geography. And as the year went on, I became more and more restless, because not only were we as graduate students asked to memorize, but we had to see to it the students memorized every little detail about what amount of sunlight was reflected and the soil compositions and things I had to memorize myself and again, and I didn't feel the students really enjoyed all these many things, and imagination was stifled. I remember we were studying weather, and I read them a little passage from Stewart's book, The Storm, which is one of my favorites. And he came to me one afternoon, he said, I hear you're reading fiction to your students in the class. Don't you have something better to do? And I said to myself, this isn't the place for me.
Right.
So I met John Gause at that university, a famous, a well-known political scientist who had written several books on regional planning. And he didn't get along too well at Wisconsin either. But he was highly respected political scientist, and he said he had just gotten a professorship at Harvard. Would I come along as his assistant? So I said, okay, I'll come along.
That's how you came to Harvard.
And
what year now?
That was 1947. But when I got there, he wasn't really able to give me an assistantship, so I went over to geography, and they were in difficulties. So I said, why not enroll in the Graduate School of Design?
Yes.
And that was a very good thing for me to do. And I spent the next 2 years in the Graduate School of Design in the Department of City Planning and Landscape Architecture, where I had some excellent teachers. Holmes Perkins, Martin Wagner, Ed Ullman was teaching there at the time. His time was primarily in city planning, but he also taught a couple of courses in geography, one on transportation and one on cities, and I took them both. He and I became pretty good friends. Logan was there, and Ackerman was there. And there was a very good link between the Graduate School of Design and geography, but I won't go into the details of the demise of geography at this time. And I taught a Radcliffe section of students in geography. That was sort of a crumb that was thrown to me. That was before women's liberation. Radcliffe was the women's college of Harvard.
So they all look forward to the Nash arrival. Yes.
And then I got the MCP degree, the Master of City Planning, and actually later on I got also the MPA, Master of Public Administration degree, when I worked in the city of Medford, and when I was the city planning director of the city of Medford outside of Boston. And then I had a number of positions upon graduation from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. First, I was the senior planning assistant in the city of Boston. Then I was a senior planner in the city of Worcester. We had some very nice associations with the Graduate School of Geography there, and some of the geography students really helped me quite a lot in developing a master plan for the city of Worcester. Then from there, I went back to the city of Boston as the senior planner for the Boston Housing Authority. Then I was offered a job with the city of Medford as the planning director. That's where I worked very closely with the city manager and really went deeply into politics, and then went back and taught some courses in the Graduate School of Public Administration. Also taught at BU and Northeastern University at night school. And slowly finished my PhD at that time. Interestingly enough, well, to me it was interesting, my PhD dissertation is not about geography.
It's about planning.
It's about planning. It's actually the role of the planning director in a council manager form of government. And
my goodness.
Could
have passed in a political science department.
It was a case study of all the city manager cities in Massachusetts, and one of the chapters, of course, was autobiographical, where I asked myself the question, what am I doing here? But each chapter also had a geographical section of each city. And from there, I I was offered a position as associate professor at the University of North Carolina, where I taught planning and also worked at the Institute for Research in Social Science. And then in 1957, when I attended the, am I going too slowly, or how much more time do we have?
We have about 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Because I want you to ask me some questions too. See, once you get me started,
yes,
I guess it's with everybody.
It's
once they start
fascinating.
talking about their life, but I'll go quickly now because you want me to concentrate on my early period. I'll just mention that from there I went to Cincinnati because I was asked to take over the Department of Geography and Geology at the University of Cincinnati and help with the separation of the two, but I made it into a Department of Geography and Regional Planning at the University of Cincinnati. I stayed there for 4 years, from 1959 to 1963. Then I was asked to be the Dean of the Graduate School at the University of Rhode Island, where I stayed for 7 years. But I also founded a School of Community Planning and Area Development there, and I was concomitantly the director of that school. And then finally, after a year sabbatical where I taught at Boston College in the Institute for Human Sciences, I was asked to come to Canada to the University of Waterloo to start a faculty of environmental studies that has 4 units, 2 professional schools and 2 academic departments. The professional schools are the School of Architecture and the School of Urban and Regional Planning, and the 2 departments are the Department of Geography and the Department of Man-Environment Studies. And I thought I'd only be there for 5 years. I've been there now for 14 years, and
feel comfortable there.
Probably will retire there. So I've been there longer than I have ever been anyplace else.
Yes, it gave you plenty scope for expressing most of those interests.
Yeah.
But that is an extraordinary career, so diverse, your interests. You know, but has there been, can you see some continuity of mission? For example, this thing that struck you during the war, that the destroyed cities demanded some solution. Was there all the time after the war that concern to make knowledge applicable to the resolution or reconstruction of reality?
I think so. Once you see a city destroyed, you also automatically think about architecture and urban design.
Yes.
So at Harvard, of course, I had to take a lot of courses in architecture too. Actually, my PhD, technically, is in architectural sciences, you see.
Yes.
And I did quite a bit of work with Walter Gropius, who was a well-known German architect who was teaching there. And so some of our exercises were actually based on the reconstruction of some of these cities that had been destroyed. So there was a connection there. And by the way, here's a little anecdote.
Yeah.
You know how some graduate students suffer through language exams?
Yes.
I'll tell you how nice mine was.
Sure.
I had to take my language exams in German and French, and I was told, see one of your professors. So I went to Walter Gropius, who also speaks French and German fluently, and I said, Professor Gropius, would you be willing to give me my German and French exams? Yeah, he said, let's go and have lunch. And we had a marvelous lunch. And the first part we spoke in French, and the second part we spoke in German. Then he signed the papers, and that was all there was to it.
What a way to get through.
Wasn't that nice?
That was a nice solution. Yeah.
But he asked me one difficult question. He said, I just had a letter from Richard Neutra, who was a famous German architect living in the US, and he asked me to give me a translation of his book. He said, how could he translate into German survival through design? And I just wasn't able. What do you say? Überleben durch Entwurf or something like that? He said, well, I'm not going to flunk you, he said, but there are some technical words in every language that are almost impossible to translate, and design is a word that is almost untranslatable because it has so many different meanings, and survival, the same thing.
Especially for...
And then we get survival through design. Well,
yes.
You asked me some questions, some
right.
specific questions now.
How important it is when I hear this story that you knew several languages, that you had a diversity of experiences geographically and humanly. How much has all of that contributed to your vision of geography today?
Well, my feeling is that one has to be completely open. And I know that I'm constantly changing. And once in a while, students come to me and they say, Dr. Nash, I really don't know what I want to do. And you know what I say to them? I don't think I know what I want to do. I have the feeling once in a while that I really haven't made up my mind yet what I want to do. I'm constantly changing. And I think a lot of scholars, or let's say Dionysians like you and me, although we have some strong Apollonian traits, really know that we are constantly changing. And geography is constantly changing. And when I talk to you about my epistemological chart and the 10 epistemologies and the 10 criteria for evaluation that we've talked about in the past, it's not, as some people think, that I want to put myself into a box and say, I'm an existentialist or I'm a logical positivist and so on, and these are the criteria that I'm interested in. But it's just to give myself a snapshot of where I am at this particular place in time. Where have I been? Where am I now? And then to have a whole panorama of all the things that I might be doing in the future. And then there are some epistemologies that you and I haven't even thought of yet. So it's a wide open world. And so I'm basically, if you want to put a label on me, maybe I should be called a pluralist.
Yes.
Because I'd like to be everything. So when I was asked at the University of Waterloo, when my term as dean was up, what department you want to be in? They wanted to put me in a box, you know.
Yes.
I said, you gave me an appointment in the Faculty of Environmental Studies, and I'm going to be a professor. So now I'm a professor of architecture, geography, and city and regional planning. I don't want to be put in any box.
That is a fortunate position to be in.
Not that I want to be more than a geographer, but I like to be a geographer and something else and something else. And I've always been that.
And you also have a philosophical streak. You want clarity of thought on the one hand, in a very abstract way, and you want to make practical solutions to problems on the other.
Yeah.
If you had to choose between one or the other, I know that you fuse them, you see
Yes.
some interaction between them, but if you had to choose one way or the other.
I think the two are inseparable, and I was particularly struck at our meeting just now that many of my friends were in applied geography and have sort of oozed into the history of geographic thought.
It's really
Right?
amazing.
Isn't it amazing? Van Parson,
Yes.
Walter Freeman. Well, we can name quite a few of them that have been dyed-in-the-wool, not applicators. That doesn't sound right. Practitioners
Yes.
of geography, and now are thinking about it. Now, some people may say, well, they're getting old, but it's not like the Canadian Senate. You know, in the Canadian Senate, it's not like the American Senate. You get appointed to the Canadian Senate after you're no longer useful, after you no longer get elected. They put you in the Senate for pasture, right? That isn't what I mean. I think a good geographer is like a two-headed bird who can look forward and backward, right? And I think what you and Walter Freeman and Van Parsons and the others that I've mentioned have in common is that we have a strong feeling for time,
Yes.
right? The flow of time. And so we do look forward, we have a vision of the future, we anticipate what is coming, but at the same time we are also deeply interested in what has gone on before, that we have a thorough understanding, this Verstehen, about what has been. And so perhaps there's just a difference in emphasis. Now we want a better understanding of perhaps the last few decades that we've gone through, and sort of say, oh, where have I been? You know, what's gone on these last few decades? And still be much interested as to what can be accomplished, but we know that our lifespan now in the future is somewhat limited.
Right.
And so we're a little bit more concerned about the retrospective view, because we know we don't have quite as many decades ahead of us as we had 30, 40 years ago.
Yes, yes. Well, it's a welcome addition to the history of geographic thought to have people with a lot of applied experience, such as you people have. It's really marvelous. You were very instrumental in that Commission on Applied Geography, and that in itself could make a long story. You've spoken, Peter, about your work in applied geography, in design, in philosophy, and the history of the field, but there's one thing that really fascinated me about your work. You wrote an article, I think it was a paper you delivered at an international congress, on the geography of music. And now music is an enormously rich mode of human expression. Does it for you, in a way, link those two interests? Does it express both of them for you?
It's not necessarily a link, but I think there's a great deal that geographers can say about music, and there's a great deal that composers or musicians can show in their art about geography, about the areas in which they live. It all happened, it seriously started back in 1968, I think it was, before the international meeting, the IGU meeting in New Delhi. And I tried to apply for a grant to go. And I didn't see much of a chance, but there was a nice grant being offered in the humanities. I said to myself, well, what do the humanities consist of? And then I thought about music. And I said, well, I think I'll do something about music and geography, because I always thought about the interrelationship between the two. And it was actually, it intensified in Boston, because Derwent Whittlesey, on some Friday afternoons, when he didn't have somebody else to go with, would say to me, Peter, would you like to go and hear the Boston Symphony? And he would then invite me, and I'd go with him. And we'd make a few remarks here and there about the geographical aspects, and we'd joke about how Sibelius would remind you of a D climate.
Yes.
How you
Not just Finland, but a D climate.
of a D climate, right? Or how you'd have Mediterranean types of rhythms, and there are certain types of melodies that can be played in certain ways that if you change the rhythm, it immediately identifies the geographical location of what you're doing. So I said to myself, what, perhaps one of the most fundamental questions, what can be shown about music on maps? And so I did about 24 different maps from the distant world music zones and the spread of polyphony and musical, the world more specifically divided into musical types, the migration of major musical systems, the distribution of world music centers, the travels of composers. In my article, there were about 20 different things. There could have been more. And so the talk consisted of the early development of music, oral music, the spread of music, and so on, the tonal systems as they're related to latitude and altitude. I used the example of Italy, where you're deep down in Sicily, only males can sing, and generally they're so deep down there. As you move up the Pennine Peninsula, especially once you cross the Alps, the women can join in, right? So there's an awful lot of, I had quite a bit of environmental determinism in this, but you can see why some of the earlier geographers were somewhat deterministic. But there are all kinds of relationships. The distribution of clocks, not clocks, that's another story. The distribution of bells.
Yes.
The distribution of raw materials to music. So one more thing is that people were shocked about this paper, and actually the newspapers in New Delhi came out the next day as geographer speaks about music, and then and they were all sort of had humor in them. Students will learn about Vienna while the gramophone plays the Blue Danube waltz. They really didn't understand what I was saying, and but the important thing is that if we can speak if geographers, and we've learned that in the last decades, if we cannot only concentrate on speaking about the tangible aspects of the environment, but we can speak about the intangible aspects. It's not only just architecture, there are a tremendous number of things in music that can be mapped.
But even the notation system
Yeah.
as a way in which to express our understanding of a place or an event or something. Yes, I was very much struck by that article. Yes.
And there have been some new studies now, and the whole aspect of soundscapes and so on. But at that time, people thought I was a little bit nuts.
Crazy.
But I had fun. It's a wonderful topic, and I think that much more will be done on that, not just with so-called classical music and music history, but what's going on at the present time. The diffusion, I'll have to speak to Hagerstein about it, really, about just the diffusion of certain types of music, or even popular records, and how quickly do they diffuse, and where are the centers of origin, and so on. There are tremendous number of geographical implications in this.
Oh yes, I think of migrant groups, the Bahia, the Brazilian groups, for example, and Caribbean groups, how much music gives them a sense of identity when away from home. And it's true of the Irish in America, it's true of Swedes in America, and so on. Yes. Well, Peter, I'm terribly sorry our time has come up. We could talk for the rest of the evening, but I think that through your life and your career and your work, you have done more than any other to make it a field that provokes the imagination, which was your own first wish about the field. And I think there is a symphony of activity here, which will be very inspiring for those who see this tape.
Well,
thank you very much, Peter.
As usual, it's been a great pleasure talking with you
For me,
and sharing a few thoughts with you, Anne.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.